The canonical bridge and Mosaic scaffolding. The Gospel of Matthew functions as the premier canonical, literary, and theological bridge between the Hebrew Tanakh and the Apostolic writings. Positioned first in the fourfold gospel corpus, Matthew was prized in the early post-apostolic church for its structural clarity, catechetical utility, and organic integration of Old Testament covenantal promises. This essay reconstructs Matthew within Walter C. Kaiser Jr.'s Promise Plan theology, demonstrating that the gospel presents Jesus as the organic continuation, true fulfillment, and eschatological climax of God's single, progressively unfolding redemptive purpose. Through its fivefold discourse scaffolding that evokes the Mosaic Torah, its Immanuel inclusio, its multidimensional understanding of pleru, and its non-supersessionist trajectory from Israel to the nations, Matthew avoids both replacement theology and artificial epical compartmentalization. Jesus fulfills the scriptures across predictive, typological, ethical, and communal dimensions, while preserving the concrete historical commitments to ethnic Israel and expanding covenantal blessing to the Gentiles, as seen in Genesis chapter 12, verse 3 and Romans chapter 11, verses 17 through 29. The result is a coherent biblical-theological reading that recovers the Hebraic cognitive environment of the first-century Jewish Christian matrix and equips the multi-ethnic ecclesia for covenantal fidelity. The Gospel of Matthew stands as the premier frontispiece of the New Testament, functioning as a canonical, literary, and theological bridge between the Hebrew Tanakh and the Apostolic writings. Positioned first in the manuscript tradition of the fourfold gospel corpus, Matthew was neither selected by accident nor ordered purely by chronological assumptions. Rather, its preeminence in the early post-apostolic church was driven by its structural clarity, catechetical utility, and organic integration of Old Testament covenantal promises. As early Christian documents demonstrate, most notably the teaching of the 12 apostles or Didache, around 100 of the Common Era, Matthew functioned as the early church's primary catechetical directory, moral handbook, and liturgical manual. The Didache draws directly upon Matthean formulas for its baptismal rite in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, from Matthew chapter 28, verse 19. Its liturgical recitation of the Lord's Prayer, paralleling Matthew chapter 6, verses 9 through 13, and its ethical instruction structured around the two-ways paradigm, which heavily echoes the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapters 5 through 7. Matthew operates as a bridge by anchoring the identity and ministry of Jesus of Nazareth within the soil of the Hebrew Scriptures, while simultaneously projecting the scope of his redemptive work outward to all the nations, pantata ethne, in Matthew chapter 28, verse 19. Rather than portraying the emerging Christian movement as a rupture from the promises made to Israel, Matthew presents Jesus as the organic continuation, true fulfillment, and eschatological climax of God's redemptive architecture. Through this lens, Matthew avoids two major theological errors: supersessionism, which claims the church replaces ethnic Israel and renders God's promises to Abraham's physical seed null and void, and artificial epical compartmentalization, which separates redemptive history into disconnected administrative eras. Instead, Matthew's gospel demonstrates what Walter C. Kaiser Jr. terms the promise plan of God, the single, progressively unfolding divine purpose that preserves the concrete historical commitments to ethnic Israel while expanding covenantal blessing to the Gentiles through the Davidic Messiah. This single plan may be traced from the proto-evangelium of Genesis chapter 3, verse 15 through the Abrahamic promises of seed, land, and blessing for all families of the earth in Genesis chapters 12, 15, and 17, the Sinai covenant, the Davidic covenant in 2 Samuel chapter 7, the new covenant heart transformation promised in Jeremiah chapter 31, verses 31 through 34, and Ezekiel chapter 36, verses 26 through 27, and its climax in the Messiah who gathers both faithful Israel and the nations without nullifying Israel's irrevocable calling in Romans chapter 11, verses 17 through 29. To fully appreciate Matthew's structural logic, one must examine its historical horizon. The Gospel's traditional title, Kata Mathathion, according to Matthew, reflects ancient scribal conventions. It signifies the gospel that has descended to us from or through Matthew, emphasizing apostolic heritage and eyewitness authority from Matthew Levi, the former tax collector turned apostle, in Matthew chapter 9 verse 9 and chapter 10 verse 3. Internal anonymity was standard historiographical convention among ancient historians. The universal attestation of Matthean authorship across early manuscript titles and patristic witnesses provides strong historical evidence for its traditional apostolic origin. Papias of Hierapolis, around 125 of the Common Era, states that Matthew compiled the oracles in the Hebrew dialect, and each interpreted them as he was able. Whether this refers to an early Semitic draft or a Hebraic rhetorical style underlying the fluent Koine Greek text that utilizes the Greek Septuagint, it preserves an early connection between the apostolic figure and the gospel. Internal and external evidence points toward composition in the late 60s or early 70s of the Common Era within the crossroads of Greek-speaking Jewish Christianity in Antioch of Syria. Following the catastrophe of 70 of the Common Era, rival Jewish factions engaged in intense debate over who truly represented the faithful remnant of Israel. Matthew's gospel functions in part as an apologetic defense, by explicitly portraying Jesus as the defender of the Torah who came not to abolish the law or the prophets but to fulfill them. In Matthew chapter 5 verse 17, Matthew demonstrates that Jesus and his followers were the true guardians of covenantal fidelity within God's unfolding promise plan. A distinctive literary feature of Matthew's gospel is its structural framework, organized around 5 major teaching discourses delivered by Jesus. This fivefold architecture deliberately mirrors the 5 books of the Mosaic Torah. Each of the 5 major teaching blocks is paired with a preceding narrative section and ends with the transitional formula, "and when Jesus finished saying these things." This structural design portrays Messiah Jesus as the new Moses and the long-promised prophet like unto Moses, foretold in Deuteronomy chapter 18 verses 15 through 18. Matthew structures the introductory narrative of chapters 1 through 4 as an exodus in reverse. Pharaoh's slaughter of Hebrew infants finds its counterpart in Herod's massacre of Bethlehem's male infants in Matthew chapter 2 verse 16. Flight to Egypt is mirrored by Joseph taking the child Jesus to Egypt. The quotation, "Out of Egypt I called my son," in Matthew chapter 2 verse 15, citing Hosea chapter 11 verse 1, fulfills the Exodus. Jesus' baptism in the Jordan corresponds to the Red Sea, and his 40 days of temptation concentrate Israel's 40 years of wilderness testing. Moses ascends Mount Sinai to receive the Torah, while Jesus ascends the mountain to deliver the sermon in Matthew chapter 5 verse 1. In the wilderness temptation, Jesus responds 3 times by quoting directly from Deuteronomy. Where Israel failed, Jesus, acting as the true embodiment of faithful Israel and the greater Moses, overcomes the tempter through covenant obedience. When Jesus ascends the mountain to deliver the Sermon on the Mount, the imagery evokes Sinai. Yet Jesus sits down in the posture of an authoritative king and teacher, proclaiming, "You have heard that it was said to those of old, but I say to you." Jesus speaks as the divine lawgiver himself. Within a promise plan framework, these 5 discourses equip the ecclesia to live in covenantal obedience, while the passion and resurrection in Matthew chapters 26 through 28 provide the redemptive power that makes that obedience possible. Jesus is the greater Moses because he successfully leads the eschatological exodus, delivering his people from captivity to sin and demonic oppression. Matthew's gospel is enclosed by a macrostructural framing device known as a chiastic inclusio. The gospel opens in Matthew chapter 1 verse 23 with the prophetic citation of Isaiah chapter 7 verse 14. "Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall call his name Immanuel, which means God with us." It closes in Matthew chapter 28 verse 20 with the risen Christ declaring, "And behold, I am with you always to the end of the age." This framing reveals Jesus as the embodiment of divine presence, the personal tabernacle and true temple where God dwells with humanity, linking directly to Old Testament tabernacle and temple theology in Exodus chapter 25 verse 8 and Ezekiel chapter 37 verse 27. This inclusion frames a narrative anchored in the covenantal promises made to ethnic Israel, while progressively expanding to encompass the nations. Matthew's opening sentence establishes this dual focus. The book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. By invoking David, Matthew highlights Jesus' royal claim to the throne of Jerusalem and the fulfillment of the Davidic covenant in 2 Samuel chapter 7 verses 12 through 16. By invoking Abraham, Matthew links Jesus directly to the Abrahamic covenant, which promised land and multiplied seed to ethnic Israel, and that in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed, in Genesis chapter 12 verse 3. Matthew's genealogy reinforces this universal non-supersessionist scope by including 4 women: Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, and the wife of Uriah. 3 were Gentiles. By incorporating them into the Messiah's legal lineage, Matthew signals from chapter 1 that Gentile inclusion is an intentional part of God's unfolding promise plan, without nullifying the concrete land and people promises that remain irrevocable for ethnic Israel, as in Romans chapter 11 verses 28 through 29. This trajectory culminates in the Great Commission in Matthew chapter 28 verses 18 through 20. The risen Jesus declares, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you." The commissioning to reach all the nations does not represent the abandonment or replacement of Israel. In first-century Jewish restoration eschatology, the gathering of the Gentile nations was the expected result of Israel's messianic redemption. During his earthly ministry, Jesus initially restricts his mission to the lost sheep of the house of Israel in Matthew chapter 10 verses 5 through 6 and chapter 15 verse 24. Once the Messianic King undergoes his sacrificial death and vindicating resurrection, the mission expands globally to incorporate Gentiles alongside faithful Israel into the one multi-ethnic people of God. Gentiles are grafted into Israel's covenantal rich root, as in Romans chapter 11 verses 17 through 24, without stripping ethnic Israel of its irrevocable calling. Central to Matthew's gospel is the concept of fulfillment, expressed through the Greek verb plerou, occurring over 16 times. Fulfillment in Matthew signifies filling something full, bringing an Old Testament pattern, institution, or word to its intended height and eschatological culmination. This multidimensional understanding illuminates Matthew's foundational statement in Matthew chapter 5, verses 17 through 20. "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, not a dot, will pass from the law until all is accomplished. Therefore, whoever relaxes one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven." Jesus explicitly repudiates the role of tearing down or invalidating the law. He came to bring it to its intended completion, fully reveal its depth, and embody its righteousness. The literary structure of Matthew chapter 5 verses 21 through 48 is fundamentally triadic, shaped by Hebraic parallelism. Each unit typically moves from traditional righteousness to the sinful pattern to a transforming initiative. Throughout the 14 triads in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus does not discard the Old Testament command. He diagnoses the internal sinful trap and prescribes a practical transforming initiative that enables genuine human flourishing, shalom. For example, regarding murder. The traditional command is, "You shall not murder," from Exodus chapter 20 verse 13. The sinful pattern is nursing unresolved anger and hurling verbal insults. The transforming initiative is active, urgent reconciliation, leaving one's gift at the altar to go and make peace with an offended brother. Jesus calls his disciples to a righteousness that exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, not by multiplying external legalistic rituals, but by transforming the human heart through covenantal loyalty and spirit-empowered obedience. This fulfills the new covenant promises that Yahweh would write his Torah directly upon the hearts of his people and cause them to walk in his statutes through his indwelling spirit in Jeremiah chapter 31 verses 31 through 34 and Ezekiel chapter 36 verses 26 through 27. The multidimensional fulfillment of Torah and the transforming initiatives of the sermon are sustained by the same Immanuel presence that frames the entire gospel. The Gospel of Matthew stands as a masterpiece of biblical theology. It functions as an indispensable canonical bridge, seamlessly connecting the grand redemptive narrative of the Hebrew Scriptures to the eschatological reality of the new covenant in Messiah Jesus. Through its fivefold discourse scaffolding, Matthew presents Jesus as the greater Moses, the authoritative king, divine lawgiver, and true embodiment of Israel, who ascends the mountain to reveal the full intent of the Torah. Through its macro-structural inclusion, Matthew assures the church that Jesus is Immanuel, God's personal presence dwelling among his people from his miraculous conception to the end of the age. By deconstructing dichotomies that pit law against grace, or Israel against the church, a biblical theological reading of Matthew reveals the organic unity of God's redemptive purpose. Jesus does not abolish the Torah, nor does he sever the root of God's covenant commitments to ethnic Israel. Rather, within the architecture of God's promise plan, traced from the seed of Genesis chapter 3 verse 15 through the Abrahamic, Sinaitic, and Davidic covenants, the new covenant promises of Jeremiah chapter 31 and Ezekiel chapter 36, and the multi-ethnic olive tree vision of Romans chapter 11. Messiah Jesus fulfills the Scriptures across every dimension, satisfying linear predictions, escalating historical types, embodying Torah integrity, and empowering his multi-ethnic disciples to walk in transforming righteousness. As the early church recognized when it placed Matthew at the opening of the New Testament, this gospel remains an enduring handbook for the church, a guide summoning every nation, tribe, and tongue to bow before the exalted King and walk in covenantal fidelity to his commands, while the concrete future-oriented promises to ethnic Israel remain secure within the one people of God.